Welcome to Three Thoughts On. Thank you for the live audience that's here still. And thank you especially to Dr. Helen Messier. Dr. Messier, how are you today?
I'm doing great, thank you. Such a pleasure to be here.
It is an honor to have you here in our podcast here in Lake Nona. We have a lot to talk about, but before we get into that, can you please give us a little bit of background of who you are and how did you come about to being here in Lake Nona with us?
How did I get to be in Florida, first of all? You know,
Yeah.
I'm Canadian to begin with. Yeah, it's been a fun journey, interesting one, kind of longish. So we'll try to give you the brief version. But, you know, I started life as a researcher, did my PhD in molecular immunology, molecular biology, genetics, and was really, that was up in Canada. I was born actually in the very northern part of Canada, the Northwest Territories.
Oh, wow.
So very different from Florida.
Very cold.
Very cold, you know, and you have the land of the midnight sun, but also dark all winter. But so I started out, you know, doing genetics and doing my PhD. That's sort of my postdoc when I finished my PhD brought me down to the States for the first time. I ended up doing that in San Diego at the La Jolla Institute for Allergy and Immunology. And then sort of went, okay, now I did my postdoc and I love research, but what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And sort of decided, you know, I either go down the research track and you apply for grant funding every year. You're never sure where their next set of money is going to come from, and the whole academia is a difficult road. And so I remember talking to two friends of mine. One was a researcher in the lab with me. The other, her husband, was a physician. And I said, you guys have seen both sides. What would you do? And first thing, go to medicine. So that's what I ended up doing. Ended up getting my medical degree. I'm a family doctor. And then went out into practice and really noticed, the first thing I noticed was a lot of chronic disease in primary care, and that the tools that I was given in medical school were not enough to actually address that epidemic of chronic disease. I was able to take symptoms away, but I wasn't able to stop or reverse the progression of these diseases. And so I ended up going, there's something wrong with this. Why can't I actually help people? You know, can make them take their headache away or make them feel better for a little while. And so I went back to the literature and started reading and going, there's got to be something else I can offer these people. Lo and behold, the literature is filled with information. And I went, why didn't I learn this in med school? You know, it's sort of that was my first kind of introduction to what we call the translational gap, or what we know in the scientific world and what we actually practice in the clinical world is still about 15 to 20 years. And that's actually true still today. And so it got me going back and really looking what else I can do, starting to look at what we call root cause medicine. That got me down the track of functional medicine, realizing that, you know, I'm not the only doctor in the world that thinks this way, and that there's other people. And so I ended up, you know, being on the faculty of the Institute for Functional Medicine, learning this approach. And when you have that approach, can actually make a difference. So it went from, you know, I looked at my patient list of chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or some of those diseases where you really don't want to see the person because you know there's nothing you can offer them, to a point where I'm excited to see them because I can work with them and I know I can offer them something. And that totally changed the game for me.
Well, that's wonderful. You mentioned a lot of things that I resonate with. My father is a retired MD in Panama, which is where I'm from. And I remember him saying years ago that, look, if you get hit by a bus, go to the hospital,
Yeah.
have them fix you up.
Exactly.
Because you need it. You know, the medical system is very good at dealing with trauma.
Yes.
But it's not as good, at least to his eyes, it's not as good as dealing with prevention and understanding how an ecosystem for an individual needs to be upgraded in order to prevent or treat disease. So it seems like you agree with that.
Yeah, 100%. have a chronic disease, heart disease, diabetes, all of these chronic diseases, our acute care medical system isn't very good at it. We even talk about managing the diseases, right? We don't say we're going to cure the diseases. We don't say we're going to reverse them. We manage them. We manage your symptoms. We make you feel okay for a while. But we don't actually look at why did you get the disease in the first place? What can we do to address that? And then stop it from progressing, first of all, and reversing it. And when you actually look at those underlying factors that drive disease, you can absolutely reverse most diseases that we consider chronic. Autoimmune diseases, heart disease, diabetes, all of those things are absolutely stoppable and reversible.
So that's an interesting thing. I mean, I'm not a doctor, I'm an engineer, but I'm a student of science. I love to read and associate with experts.
Yeah.
I love to hear from experts. Do you feel like we're at a place where we're converging more as a society to what you just said, that we can reverse some of these things? Or do you feel like we still have a lot of work to do to change that mindset?
I think there's still a long way to go. I think obviously it's a lot easier to prevent the disease in the first place. And once it's well established, it gets a lot harder. But you can. I mean, it's possible. I think in the medical community, it's still taking a while to resonate. Although if I look at my colleagues, the doctors that I teach a course on immunity, autoimmunity every year. We have about 1,000 doctors attending that course every year. So there's an interest in the medical community, absolutely, but I think the biggest interest is coming from the general population. They're getting frustrated with the state of their current medical system, not only just the whole payment model and all of that that's involved, but they're not getting the help that they really need. And so, that's led to the advent of a lot of, people, health influencers and people trying to, get in there and give different advice. But I think there's an opportunity to do this, in the right way. Not everything works. You have to, look at it. We always say, I think it was Groucho Marx that said, you want an open mind, but not so open your brains fall out. So you want to do this in a very, evidence-based way.
I like that, evidence-based.
Yeah.
Do you still practice as a family doctor today?
I do. Actually, I don't see as many patients as I used to. I'll finish maybe the journey that got me to Lake Nona here is, so I was practicing that medicine. I ended up founding a series of concierge practices in Canada because the model, again, in Canada the same way, the single payment fee-for-service model, where if you didn't see 8 to 10 patients an hour, there's no way you could even pay your overhead, right? So it was just not conducive to being able to work with people, try to figure out what was going on. It was driving their disease and really help them make lifestyle changes, all of those things that were necessary to halt and reverse disease. So the concierge medicine model allowed me that time to spend with patients. And you create that, we call it the therapeutic relationship, the doctor-patient relationship. And that's so powerful because that's a big part of the healing process. And so I founded a series of concierge practices. I ended up being recruited to HLI, Human Longevity Inc. I'm not sure if you knew that. That was Peter Diamandis and Craig Venter, the person who first sequenced the human genome, founded it. It was in San Diego. They found me and recruited me there, and I was there for a number of years, kind of one of the medical director genomics there. And that's what I met Peter Diamandis at that time. And, really the model there in the health nucleus at HLI was really being proactive preventative, right? We were doing screenings for people, full body MRIs, CT scans, echocardiograms, doing a lot of blood work, really looking for early disease so that we could, again, prevention's a lot easier than cure once the disease is established. So that's what really, I think, got me into this idea. Can we use latest diagnostics technology to find disease early? Because if you wait for symptoms to occur, you're missing 70% of disease, right? By the time someone is symptomatic, for example, of heart disease, they're going to have at least a 70% blockage, right? The vast majority of people that die of heart disease have no symptoms before they have a heart attack. And so being able to use technology to find things much earlier, I think, was so powerful. And that's what really got me into that whole concept of prevention.
And now you are here in Lake Nona.
And now I am here in Lake Nona. I'm the Chief Medical Science Officer of Fountain Life. And that's sort of Fountain Life, I would say, would be the next sort of newest, better iteration of what we were trying to do at HLI. I think we're adding in what was missing, I think, at HLI was this ongoing care. You know, it's great to find things, but now you have to do something about them. And so that's really what we're trying to establish here. We're just across the street here, actually. And we do have the latest diagnostics. We say multimodal diagnostics. So we do, what that means is we'll do, say, a full body MRI to look for early tumors or cancer, but we'll overlay that with a blood-based test, you know, multi-cancer early detection test. When you do different ways of looking for disease, you sort of decrease your chance of false positives and false negatives, right? You have different angles that you can look at things at, and that's really powerful. So we really focused at trying to identify the 4 biggest drivers of early death and disability, you know, cardiovascular disease, cancer, metabolic disease, and neurocognitive diseases like dementia. And then we look at what's driving those. So looking at things like your oral microbiome and your gut microbiome, looking at toxins in your body, those things we know are big factors that drive disease. And so we look at all of that layered in with a care team, you have a physician and a nurse and a health coach. That's also really important, a nutritionist that can help, because lifestyle change is also a really big part of it.
So that's basically full circle there. Because for those of you who may not know, Fountain Life has been now here almost 4 years?
We've been around about 4.5 years. Our first location was Naples.
Naples, correct, yes.
And we opened our center here in Lake Nona about 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
And our headquarters is right across the street, too. So we opened our headquarters about a year or so ago here. Yeah.
You know, I remember when all that happened at one of the Impact Forum events, and of course, Tony Robbins was here because he's one of the co-founders, along with Dr. Diamandis and Dr. Ariri. They were just very gracious with their time and talking to us about this model of that is very data heavy, right? You know, let's get the data from the individual. Let's do the scans. Let's invest in the most powerful available technology that we have to our fingertips to try to give you a really good idea of what's going on and where you're going, what could be happening. But the key there is what you just said is once we find that out, then what can we do about it to prevent it from getting to that place, right? And in the case of Dr. Diamandis is, and how do we get to live to 100?
Yeah, he's all about sort of longevity, escape velocity, or this idea that technology is going to keep improving and extending our lifespan faster than we age, to the point that, you know, you get that escape velocity and you don't die. Well, I'm not sure I sort of buy into that as much, but that's, you know, it's kind of fun to think about, at least. But
it's a beautiful concept, and I'm glad that, you know, we're lucky enough to have this here right in our backyard. And what I wanted to ask you about, you know, your story, you know, as a immunologist, then as a doctor, as an MD, and now looking into the world of prevention, there is one element that at least I feel like we need to do better. You know, love your thoughts on this. I feel like it's getting not easier, but harder to convince the individual of what's good for them, right? Everybody has access to Dr. Google.
Yep.
Right? And Dr. Google knows everything.
Now it's
right?
Dr. ChatGPT.
Or now we have Dr. ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude. And technology is wonderful, but I I'm not a doctor. I did research in engineering. And back in the very early 90s, when I was doing my first master's degree, research meant being in a lab, following the scientific process, failing a lot,
Yep.
and then eventually not failing, then you have to repeat it a number of times, then you got to get peer reviewed, and then you can publish something.
Yes.
Today, we have people saying, oh, I'm doing my research. Well, you're reading Google. It's not the same. Okay? And that's okay. You know, education is important. We should be reading, but we should also be questioning what we read. And it is my experience that although we're making great headway in providing the public with more opportunities to prevent, that on average, people are still doing some of the same things that cause disease. Do you agree with that, or do you see silver lining in all this?
I 100% agree with what you said. I think that's absolutely true. And there's a lot of, you know, if you go online in the internet, it's filled with people touting different health information. You know, take this supplement and it'll cure everything, or this juice is the one, and it's anti-aging and longevity, and the world is, and there's so many people and there's so much information. It's really hard to distinguish what's real and what's not, what has evidence, what doesn't. And again, and it's going to be, we're also in an era of personalization, right? There is no one diet that's right for every person in the world. There's no one right diet that's right for every person at every stage in their life. You know, if you're very active and running and working out, you need a different diet potentially than, or if you're childbearing or, you know, postmenopausal, there's a lot of different ages, stages, and underlying genetics, biochemical individuality really, that determines something should be different for you. And so if there's someone that says this is for everybody, you know, don't believe them, first of all. And also, if they don't change their mind when new evidence becomes available, I think that's a big red flag. You know, a lot of people make their name out there and they become known as the, you know, the lectin doctor or the whatever doctor, and they're not willing to look at new evidence. So the whole nature of the scientific process is what you just said, right? Testing it again, seeing it, is it reproducible? And the whole point of peer review is so that your peers can question it. They should be poking holes in it. They should be questioning. And so, and we start to learn more and more as science progresses. And so you need to be able to change your mind with new evidence. And I think
I love that you say that, because I have conversations like this regularly, and this idea, so I'm a lover of science, you know, but I'm also a lover of common sense. And I love what you said about the individuality. Our bodies are complex, and what's good for me, even within myself, what's good for me now may not be good for me 20 years from now, or it may not, what was good for me 25 years ago may not be good for me now, because my body is renewing itself on a regular basis. But this idea that scientists are out there agreeing with each other couldn't be farther away from the truth. I don't know another group of professionals that really wants to disagree with each other, because what's at stake is very important. If somebody publishes something that is, you know, potentially life-changing, you bet that scientists are going to want to disprove it because of the potential repercussions of it. So this idea that, well, they're all agreeing, and it's like, no. Scientists, and in my case, engineers, we're looking for all the holes because it's important to do so. That's part of the process, right? So you agree with that?
I agree wholeheartedly with that. That's exactly what you should do. You should always question, you know, and even in medicine, a lot of times, you know, we don't have, you know, 10,000 people, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials for everything we do. Some of it's impossible to do, right? So we're always working on the best evidence available, and it's always a discussion with your patient, you know, there's a level of risk that they're willing to take. You know, sometimes if the the risk benefit. So if you're dying of cancer, for example, the benefit of a toxic chemotherapy is going to probably outweigh the risk. But if you're healthy, you're not going to be wanting to take that. That's a simple example, right? But so you always have to look at what are you treating, what stage is it at, and what's the risk tolerance of a patient as well. You can say, look, there's nothing else out there for you. There's a new treatment. We only have data in mice. Don't know if it's going to work for you. Here's the potential side effects, and also allow the ability for people to decide what they're willing to do as well.
And that's where this new model of concierge medicine and the model of prevention, like what you do at Fountain Life now, could one day become something that is part of the day-to-day for everybody, because we need the data. Then we need to be able to talk to a team of doctors that is going to review that functionally.
Yes.
Right? Medicine has traditionally been very reductionist, where we're going to look at the heart and then we're going to look at the liver.
That's exactly right.
The people who's looking at the heart are not talking to the people that are looking at the liver, right? So I have high hopes, and I would love for you to expand on this, how you see this unfolding, that someday we're going to be able to gather all this data on myself, be able to discuss it with a team of experts, and then come up with the procedures or the processes that are going to create the ecosystem for me so that my epigenome has what it needs, so that genes are either upregulated or downregulated to make sure that I don't fall ill in XYZ way. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I couldn't have said it better myself. 100%. It will be personalized. I know that the data is really important, the individual data, and what we're doing now, with full body MRIs and CT scans or CCTAs, CT coronary angiography, where we use AI overlays to characterize plaque in your blood vessels, feeding blood to your heart. We can see soft plaque, we can see hard plaque or calcified plaque. We know that the soft plaque is the dangerous stuff. That's the stuff that can break open and cause a heart attack versus, most people now will do a calcium scan. The calcified plaque, that's the safe stuff essentially. That's the stuff that your body has walled off and protected it from breaking open. So we're looking very deep and always looking upstream, but that type of kind of analysis and diagnostics, they're still relatively expensive, right? So not everybody can afford that. But I think the fact that people that can afford it are paying for it, are looking at this, is building, just like the cell phone when it first came out. We had this, mine was this big, and it was, clunky, a brick phone. Didn't work very well, but it was crazy expensive, right? It's only because people bought them and, the technology continued to develop that everyone has one in their pocket now. The idea, I think, is the same. Our intent is, my intent especially, is to democratize what we're doing. Make this available to as many people as possible, but it's only by collecting the data, as you said. We're collecting not just the imaging data, but a lot of blood biomarkers, a lot of other data that over time we're going to see that, maybe we just have to do this simple blood test and we can predict it as well as doing the fancy scans. And so that's what we're going to get to, and that's going to make this type of analysis much more available to people. But you're right, with the ability of now AI as well. We do utilize AI. That's another thing. We have AI on our back end for our physicians, kind of a clinical decision support tool, because we are collecting a lot of data. And it's hard for one person to kind of look at all that data and see the patterns and see. So the AI is very good at pattern recognition. It's good at not missing things in the data. And so we use that to support our physicians. And that's really valuable. And then on the front end, we have an app that allows people to ask it questions, on their data as well. But the fact that, yes, I think that is the future of medicine, is really collecting this data on yourself, understanding what you personally need, and and then building that, what's your diet need to look like? How should you work out? Should you fast? Shouldn't you? Those are all things that can be very personalized. I love the fact that you talked about, the heart versus the liver. They're not separate, right? And that's true. People talk about dementia. Well, that's connected to everything. It's not just in our brain, right? Our head's not separate from our bodies. If you have inflammation in one part of your body, you have inflammation in your whole body, or oxidative stress or other things. So you can't separate them. And that is what we tend to do in medicine, right? We send you to the one specialist. And if you have inflammation in your skin, you go see the dermatologist. If you have inflammation in your gut, you go see the gastroenterologist. But we don't actually understand that it's often very similar processes driving it all.
That's very interesting. I read an article, I think it was towards the end of last year. There's this new, and please keep me honest, I'm not not a doctor, but there's this new approach at prevention that's making some waves, and it has to do with the health of cells, right? So we talked about the liver and the heart, right? Well, if you go far enough, what you see is cells. And cells have particular behavior, right? And there's this idea that if I can come up with a routine or a regimen for myself that maximizes the potential for cells to be healthy, then it doesn't matter if a cell eventually these cells group together and become a heart, or these cells group together and become a liver, right? Because I'm kind of holistically taking care of everything. Do you see eye to eye with that, or is it far more complex than that?
Yeah, I think at a high level, that's right. I mean, but I think every time it's cellular health, of course it's cellular health. I mean, because our body is made up of cells. And so absolutely we have to look after the cells, because inflammation happens at a cellular level. Oxidative stress happens at a cellular level. So I think that's very true. And in general, you want to keep all of your cells healthy. That's true. Certain cells, like liver cells, have a function, right? They detoxify, they metabolize, so there are certain things that you can do to support the cells in your liver, right? And I think, and then you can get deeper and look at the molecules. You can look at the parts of the cell. The cell membrane, for example, the little wrapping around the cells is very important. But it's more important in certain cell types than others, for example. So I think part of our challenge is even being able to measure that. We can use different technologies, the multi-omic technologies, and metabolomics and proteomics and all of those things that we use. I use them a lot. They're very valuable, but we're only collecting those from blood. Right, so I'm not doing a liver biopsy on everybody. I'm not doing a heart biopsy or a kidney biopsy and looking at the cells there. We're looking at what's floating through the bloodstream in most cases. So I think that's getting insight into your cellular health is, yes, your blood connects to every organ in your body, so it's a good way to look at it, but understanding the details of the cellular health is still a challenge, I think, for us. But yes, I agree with that in terms of our bodies are made up of cells. So yes, of course, cellular health is important. I do find a lot of people use that term when I see that in advertising. Oh, this is cellular health, or good for your cells. That's a red flag for me, because we need a little bit more detail around that. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. In the world, my world of engineering, there's a concept of diminishing returns when it comes to volume of data. Right, there is a point where too much data just doesn't give you the returns that you need or are expecting. Number one, do you agree with that? And number two, did you see that in the space of collecting the data from ourselves in order to learn more about ourselves?
I think it's sort of Yes and no. I think there's just so much that we still don't know about biology, right? There's molecules and proteins and receptors that are always being discovered. If you read the literature, every day there's a new discovery of a new molecule or a new pathway or a new protein. And so we're constantly learning, and we can't even, if you sequence, for example, the microbiome, we can sequence every gene that's in that, every piece of DNA that's in, the trillions of cells in your gut that come out, say, in the stool. There's a lot we can't even identify still, right? We can look at the sequence, but we don't know what organism that came from.
Wow.
And so there's still a lot of unknowns in biology. And so the research, the data is important because we have to look for the patterns and the new things that we're not aware of yet. But when it comes to the day-to-day clinical care, it's kind of an 80-20 rule too. I think kind of 20% of our biomarkers that we know really give us 80% of the information, at least our understanding now.
Do you feel, so if I paint you a picture of, I honestly can't remember where I learned this, but I learned it a few years back, of this process of graduating. Data is what is the most abundant. So you correlate data and you get information, right? And if you then intelligently correlate information, you end up with knowledge. But knowledge is at a less volume than the information, and the information is less volume than the data because there's an additive effect, right?
Yeah.
And then beyond knowledge, you have wisdom, right? So you put knowledge together and you end up with wisdom. So you have this ladder from data to information, information to knowledge, knowledge to wisdom. I know it's a tough question, but where do you think we are in that ladder right now? Because we know we have tons of data, a lot of which we may not even be able to process yet because we're still learning, like you say. But I feel like we have a lot more information, a lot more knowledge, but it's just not always readily available. I mean, does that resonate with you?
From the perspective of biological data, yeah. I think, yes. For example, I was looking at it today, metabolomic data, and finding these biomarkers, for example, that are correlated with cardiovascular disease. We can see that in the databases, and you see people with cardiovascular disease. You look at all of the biomarkers in their blood that are up or down, like in people with heart disease versus those that don't have heart disease. That's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean they cause the heart disease, right? They're correlated with the heart disease, so there's a lot of nuance, and yes, the understanding of the knowledge, as you say, we're still figuring a lot of that out. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that you said that dichotomy of correlation versus causality, right? And I think our brains naturally want to take a correlating event and make it a causal event, right?
We do.
Because we're looking for answers and we want to feel better and we want to look better and live better, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned something earlier tonight, that when it comes to that gap of the world of research and the world of clinical day-to-day, that there's a maybe 10, 15, 20-year gap. Do you see that with the work that you do now with Fountain Life, that we're making a dent in that, and how so?
I think that's exactly what we're trying to do at Fountain Life, is really look as upstream as possible at finding things, but also a lot of the time I spend is researching, looking in the literature, trying to understand causes and drivers of disease. So we haven't closed it by any means. A lot of times we need to do trials to really close that, and that's part of the reason we have that translational gap is, we have to identify something that might work, and then you have to test for safety, and then you have to go through phase 1, safety is phase 1 and 2 and 3 trials to even get a drug to market. That takes time. But there's certain things that you can, with our data that we can look at right away, and we're trying to do that. So I'll just give you an example. In we've just submitted our first publication at Fountain Life. It's a descriptive
wonderful
study of our cardiovascular findings. Interestingly enough, we're finding that the vast majority of people, they come in asymptomatic, we find cardiovascular disease. Even in people under 30 years old, we're finding 70% of people under 30 have at least the beginnings, if not more progressed cardiovascular disease.
Wow.
The good news, though, is that there are a small number of people in their 70s that don't have any. So it doesn't mean it's inevitable. That's a really big finding. But then you start to look at what are the biomarkers that are correlated with cardiovascular disease. Can you predict the presence of plaque, for example, by looking at the different biomarkers? And people would say, yeah, of course, cholesterol levels are going to predict the Absolutely not. There's no ability of people's cholesterol levels to predict whether they have plaque or not. We're not seeing any ability. The best we have is about a 40% ability to predict, and there's one biomarker that stands out above all the others in that prediction, and that's hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of people's average blood sugar over the last 3 months or so. So we know that people's sugar is much more predictive of whether they're going to have cardiovascular disease. It's not perfect, but it's interesting, right, that it's not the cholesterol that we've been taught all along. Doesn't mean I'm not going to treat cholesterol if I find heart disease, but it just means that you can't use those biomarkers to predict whether you're going to have it.
So cut back on the chocolate?
Maybe the really sweet chocolate. There's some good antioxidants in chocolate.
And dark chocolate.
Dark chocolate, yeah.
So technology has been advancing, which is, I feel like we live in the best of times because we have access to all this wonderful technology that you get to use, and you get to use that to look at people and look at their, their overall health. What is the baseline? So, you have, of course, you mentioned that although this is available, it's wonderful, it's not available financially for everybody, right? So we're doing the work right now of growing that, just like every new technology. Like you said, it's at first very expensive and then eventually becomes ubiquitous. So, but for those that are yet not able to afford it, what are some of the things that you've learned from the technology you get to use that someone can then do to try to get a little bit of an idea of how to prevent some of this disease?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think you can do some basic blood tests like measure your hemoglobin A1C, measure your sugar level. There's so many people that are heading into pre-diabetes, diabetes that don't know it. So that's an easy, very cheap test you can do. I think those are sort of no-brainers that people should do. And then we do know that even though we talked about earlier that there's no one right diet for everyone, there's no one right. There are certain principles, I think, that apply to most people. You do want to be careful about your sugar intake. I think that is important for pretty much everybody. Some people can handle a little more than others, but in general, I think that's really important. So, focus on plants, for your diet. I think that evidence is just overwhelming that a plant-forward diet is going to be beneficial. Getting all the different colors of the plants in your diet, eating the rainbow, that's really, I think, I often tell people, try to get 30 different plant-based foods every day. I start off with once a week, but then try to get every day. And if you include spices, if you include grains and nuts and seeds, and it's easy to do, actually. So variety is important, I think. So getting a good night's sleep, a fundamental 30 minutes of sleep less a night can totally increase your inflammation. I think those are fundamentals that are, I think, important to everybody. Movement, maintaining muscle mass as you get older. We kind of call muscle the organ of longevity. That's, I think, fundamental for pretty much everybody, because as we get older, we get frail and we get sarcopenic, or we lose our muscle mass and our bone density. But other types of imaging as well to look at, just because I reminded myself with bone density, just do a DEXA scan. Now, we do them at Fountain Life, but they're also pretty cheap to get, really easy. Measure your bone density, because you don't know, you can't feel it, right? These are all things, unless it's really bad or they're really low or really high, you can't feel your blood sugar. Unless, you break a bone, you don't know what your bone density is. And so you have to measure those things, and those are really easy, low-hanging fruit that as we get older, everybody should be looking at doing, because, it's important to kind of, we used to have a tagline, be the CEO of your own health. Yeah. It's important to take control and do that and be proactive for yourself, because if you don't do it, no one's going to do it for you.
That's wonderful. You mentioned sleep. I'm a big fan of Dr. Matthew Walker. He wrote that book, Why Do We Sleep? And I've had here, in your chair, Dr. Van der Rij, he talks about muscle mass, very, very important. You mentioned that it's an organ, we've seen that, those new reports, the endocrine organ, that it actually has a lot to do with hormonal balance. So we have all this stuff, but when you put it all together, there's actually a mental aspect to it as well.
Yes.
If I have, I wear an Oura ring, and if I put a glucose monitor, and now I'm doing all this stuff, at some point, I know individuals that do this, and they get terrorized by their own data. So now they're stressing themselves out because, oh my God, I didn't sleep well last night because look at what my Oura ring is saying. Oh my God. So there is a mental element to all this that we collectively have to take care of. Do you agree?
Oh yeah, I totally agree. There's you're right, the sort of the biohackers, maybe you want to call them, that track every little aspect of their own data, all of the wearables, and they'll get up in the morning and you'll say, how did you sleep? It's like, I don't know, let me check my Oura. It's kind of, well, how do you feel? Are you tired? Do you feel rested? Sometimes we use the devices to lose track of our own sense of our own body. So I think that mental aspect is really important too. I think I do put CGMs, or continuous glucose monitors, on most of my patients, because at least one time, and periodically after that. I don't suggest they wear them every single day for the year, but there's a lot of information they can understand. What foods tend to spike their blood sugar? That's going to be different for different people. In my case, almonds, they're supposed to be great, but they spike my blood sugar. But also things that you'll notice when you wear things like that kind of biofeedback of monitoring your blood sugar in real time, you're going to find that, wow, if I don't sleep the night before and then eat, that same food is going to have a much bigger effect on my blood sugar than if I had a good night's sleep. You're going to find out that if I go for a walk after eating something, wow, my blood sugar goes down, versus if I eat the same thing and I just sit. So those are all, I think, really important things that people learn about themselves and how to control. It doesn't mean you can't eat a certain food, but eat it, maybe, go for a walk right after. And we will find out that stress, so elevated cortisol when you're under stress, elevates your blood sugar. These are all things that I learned with my patients as I had one of my patients who sends me a text. He goes, I haven't eaten a thing, but my blood sugar just spiked. And it's like, all I'm doing is sitting here playing video games, right? So you're sort of, we know stress will cause, we know that's the effect of cortisol. It releases sugar, and so your blood sugar will go up. And so, another one was, wow, my husband and I always went for a walk after dinner. We thought we were doing great, and we rewarded ourselves with an ice cream. Oh. And they wore the CGM and saw the blood sugar spike. They just switched it. They took the ice cream first, then went for a walk. Their blood sugar was much better. So those are things that I think the wearables can be very good in educating you. when people start wearing an Oura ring, they find out that, wow, when I drink alcohol at night, my sleep suffers.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So those are, I think, very valuable insights. But once you've learned that, maybe you don't have to wear it every day. So I think, some people can get fixated on that data, and it can stress them out. If it stresses you out, you probably shouldn't be
wearing it at all.
Yeah.
What are you most excited about over the next 5 years in the space that you're in?
What am I most excited about? Yeah, I think we're going to get better and better at finding things farther upstream and really knowing exactly how personalization. I think really, we can start to predict what is going to work for an individual. Right now, we still call it the practice of medicine because it's still a little bit of trial and error. But I think we're going to get much more precise. I think AI is going to have a big impact in how we practice medicine. I think it's going to allow us to understand the data more. I don't think it's going to take the place of doctors, but there is the saying, right, that AI won't replace doctors, but doctors who don't use AI will be replaced. And I think that's going to be a really important tool as we move forward. So I'm really excited about that. I mean, this is the most exciting time to be alive with how fast things are moving and what's coming. I think it's really fun, and it's going to, I also think people are aware, as to your question earlier, there's more and more people aware of their health, that they have to do something about it. And there's going to be, I think, a drive for prevention at a bigger scale. I was listening, dementia is a really good example. I was listening to the radio, and they're saying we're going to have an epidemic of Alzheimer's disease. Our population is aging, right? The silver tsunami, we call it. We know that aging is the biggest risk factor for all chronic disease, including Alzheimer's. And people are going, we just don't have enough nursing homes. We need to build more nursing homes. Well, my thought is, no, we need to prevent the dementia in the first place. And I think there's an understanding that we know that can be done. And that's really exciting.
I am excited about that too. The one thing that makes me think is there's a lot in my father, would tell me this. He had a percentage, and he was always very cautious as to divulge what percent that number was. But he always had a percentage of patients who just didn't want to do what he told them to do. Right? And of course, then, we can do all the work, we can have all the science, we can have all the tools, we can have all the prevention techniques, but if the people don't show up for themselves, right, then there's nothing that could be done, right? Do you see that changing?
I think it comes with education. I think it comes with people understanding. Like a lot of people, they don't want to be overweight. They don't, but they don't know what to do about it. And so it starts with really education, and then understanding the fact that when we start to personalize medicine, personalize the interventions, if we tell people what's right for them, and we know it's going to work for them, they're more likely to try it. Because a lot of times I see people, I tried that and it didn't work, or I did that and it didn't work, and then they get frustrated and stop wanting to do it. Yes, ultimately you have to take your own responsibility for your health, I think. But if you don't know what to do, then that's going to be a problem. So we have to educate. We have to, again, it starts in the schools ultimately. It starts how we model this for the kids, that's still critical.
Science and common sense, right?
Science and common sense, yeah.
Well, we are running out of time, which always happens when you're having a wonderful conversation, but I wanted to leave time for questions from the audience. Are there any questions from anyone in the audience for Dr. Messier? We have one here in the front. Dr. Jacobo, from doctor to doctor.
Oh. There we go.
So I totally agree with absolutely everything that you mentioned, but one of the concerns that we have here between you and I, in terms of the the longevity and the explosion of information now in the social media, how so many experts, or how I call them pseudo experts, they are talking about pseudoscience because they read an article that probably they didn't understand completely, and they come out in a screen where thousands of people, they are going to listen to whatever they say, but which not necessarily everything is right.
Yeah.
What do you think should be our role here and moving forward, trying to educate those people to prevent misinformation and probably bad outcomes in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and it's getting worse and worse all the time, and especially with the explosion of social media and all of the health influencers out there. I think that's huge. But people also, push back when you try to be paternalistic about things, right? Saying, no, I know better, and this is the answer. So I think it does come back down to the education. One of the things that I feel very passionate about, for example, what we do at Fountain Life and my role of leading the medical and science side, is we are the trusted brand of the field of longevity, right? When there's a new study, when there's something else that comes out, we want everybody to say, well, what does Fountain Life say about that? We have a team of scientists, we have a team, quite a large team of physicians, and we do look at all those things. We debate them internally, we look at the science, we look at the evidence, and we want to be on the cutting edge, definitely, but not the bleeding edge, right? And there's a big difference there. And so I think it's really about just being that trusted voice, getting it out there, educating, but not trying to, I think people still have a choice, right? We still have to respect that they have individual choices, and that's important. But it's okay to give your thoughts on it, show the evidence, right? I think that's really important. Show people, how do you read a study? What are some of the challenges with how this study was done? And point out that's correlation, that's not causation, those kind of things. It was really interesting. Just one example of this one was when I first started doing metabolomics, we had a science team. It was the bioinformaticians, the bioinformatic people that were looking at it, and they're looking at this one metabolite, and they saw this huge correlation with cardiovascular disease. Continine, and they went, wow, we found this amazing association. No one's ever seen this before. It's awesome. And they showed it to me, and I looked at it, and I'm like, yeah, that's a metabolite of smoking, right? So there's this, this idea that there's, you see things and make big deals out of it without understanding all of the underlying things. So you're spot on in that, and I think it's going to be a challenge. It's going to take a lot of people to, you don't want to shoot down the message. You want to just give them more information to help them make better decisions.
Any other questions? We have one over here.
Hello, appreciate you. As you are going on about collecting this data and assessing for trends, obviously practices like yours are, few and far between. As that ceases to become the case, there are more practices like yours.
Yeah.
How much restriction are you seeing in the opportunity to share data and aggregate data, statewide, nationwide, countrywide, given how sensitive that data set is and how much restriction there is in storing it and being able to share it and things like that?
Yeah, actually, that's a really, really good question, right? Because ultimately, your medical data is your own, and there's a lot of privacy around that. Like, I don't like the idea of, companies just, offering tests and grabbing it for people's data. We know that data is important. What we do, for example, at Fountain Life is we have an IRB, so it's an institutional review board. It's an ethics board that's approved our research. All people that come through Fountain Life sign a consent to participate in the research. So they give their consent to be able for us to use their data, anonymized, of course. So that's why we were able to send our first publication out. So I think it's important to publish things, to share, because there's all of these amazing sets of data in all these different areas, and we're not sharing with each other. And I think that limits how quickly we can, understand and grow and develop the whole medicine in general. So we need to respect people's privacy 100%. We have to ask their permission. I think there's a lot of people out there using things like blockchain, and hey, if someone agrees to share their data, maybe they should get a benefit for that, right? If their data goes to help a company create a new product, they should share in that. I think those are things we should be looking at together to work together on this, but still respect people's privacy.
As a follow-up, is that something that you are seeing players in the industry open to? Is it like a growing interest? Is there still some resistance?
Yeah, there's a bit of resistance in that. I'm not seeing a lot of... I think things like Apple Health Kit are great for trying to consolidate data and bring them in from lots of different sources. But, medical records are notorious for keeping things siloed and not sharing them. So it's coming. It's going to be a little while. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing this as a doctor, as a medicine, but I have a personal question. How do you look as a patient into the future of all this?
So if I was a patient in looking into the future, I guess I'm calling them patients. I don't like calling people patients, but that implies that they're sick. I don't think we should say that about people. At Fountain Life, we call them members, people. So I think that's just one thing. But as a person going forward, I'm really excited because I think there's just so much available now that I know what I need to do personally to keep myself healthy, and I want to be able to implement that. But I also know that I can find things early if something comes up, and I know that if something happens, I kind of know what I can do about it too, because there's been so much progression in medicine, and especially around this area of underlying cause for chronic disease. There's some things we didn't get into, toxins and all the other things in our environment that it's really hard to control, but there's just so much that can be done. And so I think it's a really great time to be alive right now. That's what I tell my kids all the time.
Any other questions? Well, Dr. Messier, you've been wonderful. Thank you so much for being our guest here, making time. I know you have a very busy schedule, so we're very, very grateful for your time. And now we're going to have a networking session. Those of you online, thank you for being here. This was brought to you by Nona Media and Reese Lynn and Juan Santos at the MS2 Accelerator here in Lake Nona, and of course, 3 Thoughts On. We'll see you again.